On this episode of Assignment Discovery, join American troops on the front lines in the Korean War. Learn about the leaders and the turning points of this war. Examine why President Harry Truman and General Douglas MacArthur clashed. Finally, learn about Chairman Mao and how his power grew as the war progressed. And watch for questions, activities, and resources after each segment.
The following program is part of Cable in the Classroom, a free service of the cable communications industry and your local cable company.
Consider this before viewing The Korean War, Part 1. What do you know about the United States' involvement in the Korean War? As you watch the program, note important events in Asia, such as the division of Korea, the occupation of Japan, and the Chinese Civil War. Pay attention to the key players in these events. Assignment Discovery now presents The Korean War, Part 1.
June 24th, 1950. All seems quiet in Korea, an Asian peninsula known as the Land of the Morning Calm. Just 5 years before, at the end of World War II, the Americans and Soviets divided Korea at the 38th parallel. And yet, despite saber rattling, border clashes, and bellicose threats, on this day, there is peace. Early the next morning on June 25th, all pretense of serenity is shattered. North Korean Communist forces begin an intense barrage of artillery and mortar fire, the message of which is unmistakable. In the hope of forcing the reunification of the North and South as one communist-ruled country, North Korean Premier Kim Il-sung unleashes 100,000 well-trained and well-armed combat troops. They swarm into the South, meeting little resistance from a brave but ill-prepared South Korean army. Within 3 days, South Korea's capital, Seoul, falls. Refugees flee further south, the North soldiers in hot pursuit. News of the invasion crosses the Sea of Japan to the Tokyo headquarters of General Douglas MacArthur, supreme commander of the Allied powers. An emergency session of the United Nations Security Council is called. Korea is the first real test of the world body, just 5 years old. The Security Council passes a unanimous resolution urging members to render such assistance to the Republic of Korea as may be necessary to repel armed attack. In Washington, President Harry S. Truman fears the North Korean invasion is just the beginning of a communist master plan to conquer the free world. Truman is convinced the Korea attack is nothing more than a trick. The real threat, he believes, is a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Frustrated by 5 years of communist arrogance in the Cold War, Truman is determined to join the fight. Privately, he tells his daughter, "By God, I'm going to let them have it." Yet, he enters battle with a military barely more than 1/10 the size of his World War II forces.
Into Korea along the U.S. Air Force route from Japan for on-the-scene films from inside Asia's crisis point. With communist invaders pouring south past the 38th parallel, their prong-like attacks have already enveloped many South Korean units. And more Southern Korean troops were rushed up to fill in the gaps.
The first American combatants are 540 men flown over from MacArthur's occupation army in Japan, designated Task Force Smith. They are almost as ill-equipped and trained as the South Koreans. Their mission is clear: to stop the North Korean advance. July 5th, 1950. In rain and haze, the soldiers of Task Force Smith are entrenched outside the town of Osan. Headed straight into their positions is a column of Soviet-made T-34 tanks.
We were hitting the tanks. Absolutely no problem of hitting it, but it didn't make any difference. That was my first appreciation that we had a serious set of problems.
Task Force Smith has been issued outdated anti-tank weapons that already had proven useless against German armor in World War II. The North Korean tanks barrel through the American barrage. Dazed and overwhelmed, radios knocked out by the rain. With 155 casualties, Task Force Smith retreats, succumbing to a disease of the spirit that becomes known as bug-out fever. In the wet and the chaos, many of the men of Task Force Smith wander the countryside for days, trying to get back to the safety of the rear. At the end of World War II, the United States had emerged triumphant, the greatest power in the history of the world. Now, just 5 years later, the U.S. faces humiliation and defeat in a country that's name has been unknown to most Americans only days before. It is a bitter and humbling turn of events. July 15th, 1950. North Korea and its tanks continue to roll through the south, like the Nazi blitzkrieg across France 10 years earlier. All the overpowered American and South Korean troops can do is delay what increasingly seems inevitable: defeat. In the United States, now that the public has figured out where Korea is, the overriding question becomes, why? The Korean Peninsula lies at an Asian crossroad, a strategic location near China, the Soviet Union, and Japan. Koreans were known to describe their land as a small rabbit constantly being fought over by its larger, more aggressive neighbors. Occupied by Japan from 1910 to 1945, at the end of the Second World War, Korea was divided in two, with loyalties split north and south, between East and West. The United States supports South Korea and its American-educated President Syngman Rhee, a fervent anti-communist. The Soviet Union pours massive military and economic aid into North Korea and seals off its border with the South. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin installs a puppet regime led by dictator Kim Il-sung. By the spring of 1950, the decision by Stalin has been made. The North Koreans will invade the South and unite the peninsula under communist rule. Now, in mid-July, as the Allies' hold on the South grows more precarious, the United Nations appoints the most powerful man in Asia, General Douglas MacArthur, to take command. Ever the lover of military history, MacArthur strides to war in Korea, accompanied by one of his favorite regiments, the Army's 7th Cavalry. The 7th was itself a legend, the unit once led by George Armstrong Custer. MacArthur's love of the past blinds him to the reality of the present. First, the North Koreans are not the barefoot, third world rabble he has arrogantly assumed. Second, the U.S. military is not the same fighting force that won World War II. Since 1945, the American defense budget has been slashed from $82 to $13 billion. The armed forces cut from 12 million men and women to 1.6 million. In Japan, the 7th Cavalry had been acting as policemen with little training and antiquated weapons. Now, they are in a real shooting war. August 1950, United Nations forces and the South Korean Army seem powerless before the North Korean juggernaut. Only 30 miles more, and the UN will be pushed all the way back to the port city of Pusan, and literally out to sea.
Many began to develop a resignation that we would soon have to be withdrawing from the peninsula. MacArthur never accepted that premise. In fact, he rejected, in my hearing on countless occasions, any talk of a need to withdraw. He knew that we could hold. And it was his character and that of General Walton Walker, who commanded our Pusan perimeter, that I think performed the impossible.
Atop hills overlooking the south bank of the Naktong River, General Walton Walker establishes a final defense line. Dug in along the river is the 7th Cavalry.
Once we got on the south side of the Naktong River, we were informed that there would be no more retreats. That we would stand, hold our positions, no more withdrawals, and that if we had to, we'd have to die in that position. And that's the way it was stressed to us, that we had to hold.
It is the beginning of the fight back. In heat and dust so thick it clogs their guns and vehicles, the 7th Cavalry fights on. They fight from hill to hill, back and forth, and still the Pusan line holds. A breakthrough is needed to end the current stalemate at the Pusan perimeter, a bold idea that will move the war in a new direction. General MacArthur says he has one. In one master stroke, MacArthur believes he can win the war. He will stage a massive amphibious landing behind enemy lines at the port city of Incheon. MacArthur says, "I can almost hear the ticking of the second hand of destiny. We shall land at Incheon, and I shall crush them." September 15th, 1950, MacArthur's D-Day has arrived. The Incheon invasion is either a bold move that will change the course of the Korean War, or a landing so bloody it may rival Iwo Jima or Normandy. Before Incheon can be taken, the Marines must capture the island of Walmido, which rests at the approaches to the landing site. The possibility of heavy resistance makes everyone apprehensive. Commanding a Marine battalion is Colonel Robert Taplett.
We got a message from higher headquarters that we were to continue the landing on Walmido until we had 83% casualties. And that's when I got a little bit concerned. Because I said, my God, what are we getting into?
The Marines storm the island and meet surprisingly little resistance. In less than 90 minutes, Walmido is secure. By the next day, Incheon is in the hands of the United Nations forces. MacArthur's roll of the dice has paid off. The day after Incheon, the second part of the new Allied strategy is revealed. After weeks of pounding by the Communists, General Walton Walker's men begin a breakout of the Pusan perimeter. Leading the way is the 7th Cavalry. They push north and west to join up with the forces striking out from Incheon. The entire course of the Korean War has changed in just 2 short days. Now it's the Americans on the offensive. They are closing in on Seoul, the South Korean capital. After 3 days of fighting, street to street, the South Korean flag is raised. September 29th, 1950. In an emotional ceremony at the National Assembly Building, MacArthur formally returns the city to President Syngman Rhee and the South Korean government. It is as triumphant a moment in MacArthur's career as his return to the Philippines. He is certain complete victory is now at hand. Watching the remarkable turn of events is Communist China's great chairman Mao Zedong. Just a year earlier, Mao had gained control of China by defeating rival Chiang Kai-shek and his American-backed nationalist forces. He believes the United States intervention in Korea is an American scheme to expand into East Asia and perhaps China itself.
North Korea is communist like China, and we are brothers. If we didn't send forces to support our brothers when they were in danger, then American troops swallow them up and then invade our homeland.
Such views mirror those of Mao precisely. If the U.S. imperialists win, he says, they may get so dizzy with success that they may threaten us. Victories at Inshan and Seoul convince him that his prophecy is about to come true. Chairman Mao has 500,000 troops waiting in Manchuria. He is ready to use them. MacArthur and his troops think the Korean War is all but over. Washington gives him permission to cross the 38th parallel into North Korea in order to destroy the fleeing Communist Army. After all, Secretary of State Dean Acheson reasons, it would be ridiculous to march up to a surveyor's line and stop. Yet there is caution. MacArthur is warned to stop at any hint of Russian or Chinese intervention. And American forces are to halt well short of the Yalu River, North Korea's border with China's Manchuria. MacArthur ignores the orders.
The word was that when we got to the Yalu, or to the mouth of the Yalu, we were going to stop at the last hill before the river and form a defensive position. We were not to fire in the direction of the Yalu River, and that we would be relieved by South Korean troops, and then we were going home. And so it was a tremendous, exciting thing, because once we got that objective, well, then we were going home. So you say to me, how did we feel? We felt great.
For the first time since arriving in Korea, the 7th Cavalry begins to relax. In the midst of all the relief and jubilance, MacArthur receives a summons from President Truman. The president wants a face-to-face meeting, their first. It will be held at tiny Wake Island in the mid-Pacific. At home, Truman, a Democrat, is being attacked by Joe McCarthy and other right-wing Republicans, and midterm elections are just a couple of weeks away. A photo opportunity with America's brightest hero couldn't hurt. MacArthur sets off for Wake, peeved at being interrupted at the wind-up of his great campaign. As for Truman, he writes to a cousin, "I've a whale of a job before me. Have to talk to God's right-hand man tomorrow."
In this spirit, the president flew to Wake Island for the momentous parley. Arriving at daybreak, he met his Pacific commander for the first time face to face. The world heard later they shared a complete unanimity of view on the Korean War.
Truman is genuinely concerned about Chinese threats to enter the war. MacArthur assures the president that there will be no Russian or Chinese intervention. If the Chinese tried to get into Pyongyang, he says, there would be the greatest slaughter. The war, he insists, will be over by Thanksgiving. October 15th, 1950. On the very day MacArthur guarantees the Chinese will not intervene, Mao dispatches the first of 250,000 troops across the Yalu River into North Korea. Increasingly, American and South Korean troops report encounters with soldiers believed to be Chinese. MacArthur is dismissive. He thinks it's nothing more than a handful of Chinese volunteers. Oblivious, the confident MacArthur urges his men onward. He watches as a drop of 4,000 paratroopers go in to trap the North Korean army and save American POWs. As far as the Chinese are concerned, the trap is theirs. They believe they have guilefully lured the Americans far too deep into the north. The Chinese military leader, Marshal Peng, tells his staff, in order to hook a big fish, you must let the fish taste your bait. MacArthur boasts that he has never been defeated. we'll see who is going to wipe out whom. In less than 6 months, the United States has seen the fortunes of war swing from staggering defeat to near total victory. Now, events will conspire for one more dramatic and potentially catastrophic change.
Now that you've seen the Korean War, Part 1, talk about this. In 1950, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung sent troops into South Korea, hoping to force the reunification of Korea into one communist-ruled country. Discuss why Korea's location made it an important country for the communists. Now, try this. Pretend it is the 1950s and the Korean War is over. Write an editorial for your hometown newspaper expressing your opinion on the events that happened during the Korean War. For videos, CD-ROMs, lesson plans, and teacher resources on this topic and more, log on to discoveryschool.com. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests The Korean War by Michael V. Ushan. Consider this before viewing The Korean War, Part 2. What do you know about President Harry Truman and General Douglas MacArthur? As you watch the program, note the different views, strategies, and personal characteristics of these men. How did each man affect the outcome of the war? Assignment Discovery now presents The Korean War, Part 2.
I just didn't believe that it was over. I couldn't, there wasn't anything I could put my finger on. I guess you'd call it a gut feel.
It is called the Home by Christmas Offensive. The 8th Army and the heroes of Incheon, the 10th Corps, hoped to end the Korean War by advancing to the south bank of the Yalu River, North Korea's border with Manchurian China. Despite concern from Washington, General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of the United Nations forces, is sure the Chinese would not dare retaliate. Soldiers in the field are not as confident. In North Korea, with MacArthur's chief of staff, is Lieutenant Alexander Haig.
And we began to pick up prisoners. Prisoners who were well equipped, obviously extremely well trained, and fully outfitted for winter warfare. We would go back and write rather alarming messages to Tokyo, and Tokyo just simply seemed unwilling to face it.
Of far more immediate concern to the men on the battle lines is the icy curse of winter. Freezing winds from Siberia send temperatures to 40 below zero. Canteens burst. Equipment snaps like glass. Oil freezes in weapons, rendering them useless. The men lack proper winter clothing. Every motion is slow and labored. Winter is an equal opportunity hardship. It torments friend and foe alike. But now the cold conspires with the Chinese to create one of the greatest disasters in American military history. Over the course of a few weeks, right under the noses of United States intelligence, Chairman Mao Zedong has ordered 250,000 Chinese soldiers across the Yalu River into Korea. The Chinese are a people who have spent centuries on the defensive against invading foreign powers. And now, a new threat, the vast American-dominated fighting force at their very border. November 27, 1950. Marching into a Chinese trap are the soldiers of 10th Corps. They are unaware that 100,000 communist troops wait for them in the rugged terrain surrounding a place that will symbolize all the desperation and heroism of war in Korea, the Chosin Reservoir. Mao Zedong's military tactician Marshal Peng has a simple strategy. Lure the enemy forces into our internal line, he says. Wipe them out, one by one. "10,000 Marines and 2,500 soldiers of the U.S. Army are on either side of the Chosin Reservoir. On the west side, Marine Colonel Robert Taplett's battalion is one of the first to be hit. He is shocked by what he sees.
I was absolutely stunned. I'd never seen Marines in that shape before. They're obviously in a lot of shock, not only from being overrun by the Chinese, but also from the cold. And there they were, without weapons, some of them barefooted, some of them in shorts, and they were damn near frozen stiff.
Despite being outnumbered 10-1, the Marines are determined not to abandon their equipment or their wounded and dead. On the east side of the reservoir, the Army's 7th Infantry Division is in even more fatal trouble than the Marines to the west.
On the east side, the reservoir is getting extremely desperate because they had at least 2 airdrops in there, and most of the supplies landed in the Chinese sectors. They were running out of ammunition. They were running out of food. They had no way to heat anything. They had no water. The men were eating chunks of snow they were so dehydrated. It was getting worse and worse.
The men of the 7th Infantry fight bravely, but are overwhelmed by the mass attacks of the Chinese. Their only escape route south to the town of Hagaru is cut off. Facing annihilation, they abandon their vehicles and have no opportunity to collect their dead. General Douglas MacArthur has tickled the tail of the giant Chinese dragon and is now paying the ghastly price. Just a few weeks earlier at Wake Island, he had guaranteed President Harry Truman that China would never enter the war. Now at the Chosin Reservoir and throughout all of North Korea, his United Nations forces are in headlong retreat. Foot soldiers and commanders alike begin to question the leadership and judgment of Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur counters criticism by saying the Truman administration is forcing him to fight with one hand tied behind his back. He wants to expand the war into China, but Washington says no. Meanwhile, the agony of 10th Corps goes on. They have regrouped in the town of Hagaru, south of the deadly Chosin Reservoir. Troops and vehicles crowd together. The men are in desperate need of supplies and reinforcements and are still surrounded by the Chinese. They are battered by the now familiar lethal combination. Fearsome Chinese attacks by night and the relentless, vicious cold. MacArthur orders his 10th Corps to fall back from Hagaru to the port city of Hungnam and evacuation by sea. The breakout begins. Army troops of the 10th Corps create a defensive corridor through which the Marines can escape. December 10th, 1950, 2 weeks after the first Chinese attacks, the beleaguered men of 10th Corps begin trickling into Hungnam. By Christmas Eve, the final remnants are loaded onto ships and sent south to Pusan. 105,000 troops and 91,000 Korean refugees have been evacuated. Left on the Hungnam beach are gasoline, bombs, and dynamite, believed too volatile for transport. The Americans blow them up. A final gesture of fury and exasperation. The Chinese, who have suffered even greater casualties from battle and the fierce winter, have succeeded in driving all United Nations forces back below the 38th parallel. Mao Zedong has his great victory, a surprise and success that rival that of MacArthur's at Incheon. He decides to take the offensive and force the West out of Korea for good. As a result, a panic-stricken America considers a potentially calamitous, desperate act. Reeling from the power and ferocity of the Chinese offensive in Korea, the United States faces the very real possibility of total and humiliating defeat. General Douglas MacArthur finds this unthinkable and advocates the use of as many as 50 atomic bombs against the Chinese. The Chinese vow to fight on no matter what the United States hurls at them. You can use the atomic bomb, Mao Zedong counters. I will use my hand grenade. I will catch your weak point and defeat you.
Through the freezing wintry weather of North Korea, the United Nations forces fall back in the face of the massive Chinese Communist offensive.
The disaster at the Chosin Reservoir is being repeated all over North Korea. Hit hardest is the 8th Army. They withdraw from the Yalu River to south of the 38th parallel, moving 120 miles in just the first week and a half. It is the longest retreat in American military history. The men of the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, are among those staggered by the size and fury of the Chinese assault. Since arriving in Korea in July 1950, the 7th Cavalry has seen some of the toughest combat of the war. In October, they had been one of the first units to enter North Korea. Now, as the new year of 1951 approaches, they flee to the south. South Korea's capital, Seoul, once more falls into the hands of the communists. Even Incheon, site of America's greatest triumph in Korea, is relinquished. Its harbor is blown up to keep the food, weapons, and vehicles there from liberation by the Chinese and North Koreans. And then, one of those curious accidents of history occurs. On December 23, 1950, the 8th Army's commander, General Walton Walker, is killed when his Jeep collides with a South Korean Army truck. As great a tragedy as this is, his replacement will turn the 8th Army around and save it from certain destruction and disgrace. General Matthew Bunker Ridgway, 56 years old, a legendary World War II paratrooper who led airborne assaults at Sicily, Normandy, and the Battle of the Bulge. MacArthur tells him, "The 8th Army is yours, Matt. Do what you think is best." What Ridgway does in an astoundingly short time is revive the fighting spirit of the 8th Army. He improves conditions for his troops with better and more food, clothes, weapons, and ammunition. Ridgway urges them to think like infantry, getting off the roads and targeting the hills where the Chinese hide. At the same time, Mao Zedong has made a serious error in judgment. As MacArthur had done before, Mao has moved his troops too far, too fast. His supply lines are overextended. Chairman Mao has let his ambition cloud his thinking. He has suffered far more casualties than the United States and its allies. His troops are cold and exhausted. Their revolutionary fervor and morale are in decline. Reinforcements are untrained, ill-equipped, reluctant conscripts.
The Communist Party used two methods of treatment when they asked ordinary people to join the army. If they refused to join, they were forced to sit on a hot furnace. When they stood up, that meant they were ready to volunteer and go to the battlefield.
Although they still outnumber the United Nations troops, the Chinese lack the firepower of the Allies. They have little artillery and no attack aircraft in Korea.
The Chinese weapons were crude compared to the Americans. The Americans used missiles that looked like stars in the sky, and they fell here and there. This was their strength.
Pinned down by American fighters and bombers during the day, the Chinese are forced to hide in caves and tunnels. They can only attack at night.
The environment and the condition were terribly poor and rough. We never got to drink any hot water for a year. The water was filthy. We had nothing to eat. We couldn't cook because the smoke gave away our position, and we would be bombed.
Once more in this incredible saga of war, the tide is about to turn yet another time. The Truman administration now favors a limited war, one that can beat the enemy back to a position from which peace talks can begin. General Douglas MacArthur, however, has his own foreign policy. There's no substitute for victory, he says, and that means all-out war with China. Despite warnings from the president himself, MacArthur continues to vent his frustration, loudly and often. Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon refuse to yield to MacArthur and his Republican supporters in Congress. MacArthur infuriates Truman with his continued interference and pronouncements.
He thought he was running a better government in Japan than you are running a better government in Washington, was one of his greatest punchlines that he would always put in private conversation.
Rumors of political ambitions on the general's part only make the situation worse. A young aide on MacArthur's staff is Lieutenant Alexander Haig.
MacArthur, as a result of Inchon, began increasingly to surface as a potential Republican candidate for president. Let me tell you from firsthand experience, when presidents suspect they have competition, they're going to take care of it. And MacArthur had to go.
MacArthur steadfastly has refused to accept any responsibility for the sudden turn in Korea, while publicly blaming Washington. Truman says, "I could no longer tolerate his insubordination." MacArthur is out. With MacArthur out of the way, Truman begins looking for a settlement to the war in Korea. By June of 1951, both sides are in a stalemate, facing each other at roughly the same point where the war had begun. On June 25th, an exact year after the first North Korean invasion, Ridgway receives dramatic news from Washington. The Chinese want to talk peace. What the negotiators and the troops do not know is that another 2 years will pass before there is an armistice. Another 12,000 Americans will die while the two sides haggle over the bargaining table. But for many of the troops who have survived this first bloody, surprising, agonizing year, it is time to go home. The Americans, battle-weary and worn, are happy to have made it through the nightmare. The fact that South Korea exists is proof to most that the war was worth fighting, that the last full measure the troops offered made a difference. On that distant Asian battlefield, the world dodged a bullet of mighty proportions. The price? Millions of lives. At a time in hell that sorely tested the ability of free people to resist, survive, endure.
Our young men stood the test of battle, and they stood it well. They stayed, they fought. And I don't know what else you can ask an American to do.
Keep watching Discussion topics, an activity, and resources for the Korean War are up next on Assignment Discovery. Now that you've seen the Korean War Part 2, talk about this. How were the personalities of President Harry Truman and General Douglas MacArthur different? How did their personalities affect their leadership styles? Compare the leadership styles of President Harry Truman and General Douglas MacArthur. Now, try this. Research the current conditions of North Korea and South Korea. How have their economies and politics changed since the end of the Korean War? For videos, CD-ROMs, lesson plans, and teacher resources on this topic and more, log on to discoveryschool.com. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests Korean War by Kathleen Gay and Martin Gay.
The preceding program is part of Cable in the Classroom, a free service of the cable communications industry and your local cable company.